I watched the 20-year-old wrap his hands with theatrical slowness, telling the crowd of neighbors gathered around him that he was about to teach the broke landscaper next door a lesson he'd never forget. He thought I mowed lawns for a living. He had no idea he was about to challenge a former Navy SEAL platoon chief. 6 weeks later, he'd be the one apologizing, and his father would be the one packing boxes. My name is Marcus Ryder, and this is how a quiet neighborhood in Brookhaven, Ohio, found out that the calmest man on the street was also the most dangerous. Stay with me to the end, you won't believe how it ends. And if stories like this get you through your evening, hit subscribe to Storiez Tales. For 4 years, my life had been beautifully, deliberately ordinary. After 18 years in the Navy, 3 of them as a platoon chief running direct action missions I still can't fully talk about, I traded my kit bag for a toolbox. I run a small home security consulting business out of my garage, mostly helping local businesses set up cameras and access control. I live in a modest 2-story on Larkspur Lane with my 14-year-old daughter, Sophie, ever since my wife Diane passed 3 years ago. Sophie was the reason I'd taken the quiet path in the first place, the reason I answered emails about motion sensors instead of chasing another contract overseas. Brookhaven was the kind of neighborhood where the biggest news of the month was somebody's dog getting loose, or a mailbox getting knocked over by a snowplow. People waved from their porches. Nobody locked their cars. That changed the summer the Whitfields moved in next door. They didn't arrive quietly. A convoy of moving trucks blocked the street for 2 full days, and within a week the modest colonial that used to belong to a retired couple named the Garzas had sprouted a new circular driveway, a fountain, and a security gate that never actually seemed to close. Rich liked to tell anyone within earshot exactly what the renovation had cost, usually rounding up. Richard Whitfield, everyone called him Rich, and he made sure you knew why, had made his fortune flipping distressed commercial properties across 3 counties. He drove a cherry red Escalade with dealer plates he never bothered to swap, and he had a laugh that carried across 3 backyards. Rich wasn't really the problem, though. The problem was his son, Tyler. Tyler was 20 years old, built like he lived in a gym because he did, and he'd spent the last 4 years training in Muay Thai at a downtown studio called Ironclad Combat Academy. He'd won 2 regional amateur titles and never let anyone forget it. Within days of moving in, he'd set up a full standing bag and a set of Thai pads in the side yard, right along our shared fence line, and every evening around 6 he'd put on a show, spinning elbows, teeps, knees into the bag hard enough to make the fence posts shudder. I'd sit on my porch with coffee and watch. I could tell within the first 10 minutes that Tyler had good raw athleticism and 0 real fight IQ. He dropped his guard after every combination. He squared his hips on his kicks instead of turning them over. His chin drifted up every time he committed to a strike, leaving his jaw wide open for a fraction of a second longer than it should have. He was a kid who'd been taught to look impressive for judges holding scorecards, not to survive an actual exchange where nobody was going to stop the clock for him. I didn't care. Let him have his hobby. Plenty of young men need somewhere to put their energy, and a heavy bag beats most of the alternatives. The trouble started small, the way it usually does. Tyler began confronting the mail carrier over where the truck parked, standing in the man's path with his arms crossed until he backed the vehicle up 10 feet just to avoid a scene. Then he started slow-rolling his modified Charger past the bus stop every morning, revving the engine until the younger kid stepped back off the curb and onto the grass, laughing with his buddies riding shotgun like it was the funniest thing in the world. A few of the parents mentioned it in passing at the mailbox, the way people do when they're hoping someone else will handle it. Nobody wanted to be the one to say something to the Whitfields. The first time Tyler came at me directly was in June. Sophie was in our driveway, wiping down her bike, radio on low. Tyler walked over shirtless, in his gym shorts and his Ironclad Academy hoodie tied around his waist, and without a word he reached over and yanked her earbuds out, coiling the cord around his fist. "Annoying," he said flatly, and dropped them on the pavement. Sophie froze. I was down the steps in seconds, not running, walking, the way you walk when you want someone to notice you're not afraid, not because you're posturing but because sprinting tells an opponent exactly where your center of mass is going. Everything okay here? I asked, voice even, hands open and loose at my sides. Tyler looked me up and down. I'm 44, 6 foot, but I wear cargo shorts and faded t-shirts with hardware store logos on them. I look like a man who spends Saturdays at Home Depot, not a man who spent a decade breaching doors in the dark. Your kid's music is annoying, old man, he said, stepping into my space, smelling like protein powder and cheap cologne. You got a problem with that? My pulse didn't move. When you've had a green laser walk across your chest plate in a compound outside Kandahar, a 20-year-old in gym shorts doesn't register as a threat, he registers as a variable to manage. Tyler, right? I'm Marcus. This is my property line. Don't touch her things again. Go home. He scoffed, called me boomer, and walked off laughing. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. In Tyler's world, calm wasn't confidence, it was weakness. Because I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't squared up, hadn't given him anything to push against, he decided I'd back down from anything. Real strength, in his mind, was volume. Since I hadn't shouted, I must not have had anything to shout with. By late July, that assumption turned into something worse. For a few weeks after that first encounter, things were merely irritating rather than alarming. Tyler took to standing at the fence line during his workouts, staring pointedly at our kitchen window while he shadowboxed, like he was rehearsing for an audience. He'd toss the odd comment over the fence about old guys who used to be tough whenever he saw me carrying groceries in. I let it slide off. A man who's spent real nights in real danger develops a fairly high threshold for what counts as a threat, and a 20-year-old's insecure posturing barely registered above background noise. Sophie, though, had started taking the long way around the block to avoid walking past his yard, and that's the part that actually mattered to me. Then came the incident at the community pool. It was mid-August, one of those flat, humid afternoons where half the neighborhood ends up at the shared pool just to escape the heat. Sophie and two friends were doing laps in the shallow end when Tyler and his training partners showed up, cannonballing in without checking who was near the edge, splashing a group of younger kids hard enough that one of them started crying. When the lifeguard, a college kid named Devin who couldn't have been more than 19 himself, asked Tyler to cool it, Tyler laughed in his face and told him to go find a real job. Sophie, to her credit, quietly gathered her towel and left rather than stick around for whatever came next, but she came home shaking, not from fear exactly, more from the particular helplessness of watching an adult in charge get steamrolled by someone half his authority and twice his arrogance. That was the night I decided the next time Tyler crossed a line with my daughter anywhere in it, I wasn't going to simply absorb it and move on. I didn't have to wait long. Tyler had just won a regional title, and Rich threw him a backyard party with a rented sound system that shook our windows past midnight. A few days later, Sophie had two friends over for a study session on our back patio. Tyler decided this was his stage. He dragged his pads to the fence line and started throwing loud combinations, deliberately snapping branches off my late wife's rose bushes, making crude comments every time the girls glanced over. When Sophie texted me that she felt unsafe, something in me went very still and very clear. I walked out, stood at the property line. Tyler. Stop breaking the bushes. Free country, he said, grinning at his two training partners lounging in my neighbor's lawn chairs. Doing conditioning work, old man. You gonna stop me? I don't care about the bushes, I said. I care about you harassing my daughter. Move it somewhere else. His face went red. He crossed onto my side of the line and grabbed a fistful of my shirt collar to shove me back. Muscle memory doesn't ask permission. Before I'd consciously decided anything, my hips had already rotated, his wrist was trapped against my chest, and a small, precise rotation of pressure on his forearm put him on his knees in the grass, gasping. I let go instantly, stepped back, hands up. Careful, tree root right there, I said loudly, for his friend's benefit. It looked, to anyone watching, exactly like he'd tripped. He scrambled up, red-faced, sputtering that I'd attacked him. I told him to watch his step and walked the girls inside, calm on the surface, though my pulse was finally starting to climb, not from fear, but from the particular, cold clarity that comes when a manageable situation tips towards something less manageable. An hour later Rich was pounding on my front door hard enough to rattle the glass, Tyler sulking behind him with his wrist cradled to his chest. "You put your hands on my son," Rich barked before I'd even gotten the door fully open. "He's a two-time regional champion. Champions don't just fall down in the grass for no reason." His face was mottled red, and he jabbed a finger toward my chest without quite touching it. "You so much as look at him wrong again, and I will bury you in legal fees until you're selling that house to pay your lawyer. I know judges in this county. I know the mayor. You have no idea who you just made an enemy of." "Rich," I said, keeping my voice level, "your son crossed onto my property and grabbed my shirt. Check your own doorbell camera if you don't believe your neighbors." That only made him angrier. He stormed off across the lawn, Tyler trailing behind with a smug, wounded look aimed back over his shoulder, like he'd somehow won something by losing. I closed the door and poured a glass of water, and I knew, with the same clarity I used to feel before a mission brief, that this wasn't over. It was only a matter of when, and I suspected it wouldn't be long. The climax came at the Brookhaven Founders' Day picnic over Labor Day weekend, the one event where the whole street turns out, grills lined up along the cul-de-sac, kids running through sprinklers, folding chairs scattered across every lawn. Somebody had strung up lights between two oaks. The smell of charcoal and barbecue sauce drifted down the block, and for a while it felt like the neighborhood I remembered from before the Whitfields moved in. I was near the drink table talking with Walter, a retired schoolteacher who'd lived on the street 30 years and remembered when it was still half farmland. Sophie sat nearby on the curb with a few neighbor girls, laughing about something on someone's phone. Then the Whitfields arrived, and the temperature of the afternoon changed before either of them said a word. Tyler wasn't dressed for a picnic. He wore his ironclad rash guard, fight shorts, and carried a gym bag, flanked by two training partners walking with the same exaggerated swagger. He walked straight through a group of kids playing tag without slowing down, marched up to me, and dropped the bag at his feet with a heavy thud. The chatter around us died. "Hey, Marcus," he said, loud enough to carry. We never finished that conversation from the yard. "It's a picnic, Tyler. Go get a burger. I don't eat garbage." He unzipped the bag, pulled out 2 pairs of sparring gloves, and threw one at my feet. "You got lucky last time. Cheap shot. Let's see how tough you are for real. Right here. 1-on-1. The music actually cut out somewhere behind us. Dozens of neighbors turned to look. I saw Sophie stand, face pale. Rich stood by his car with a beer, smiling like he'd already won. Walter tried to step in, "This is a family event, Tyler," and got waved off with a sharp, "Stay out of it, Walt." I understood the trap. Walk away, and Tyler would terrorize my daughter believing I was permanently submissive. Call the police over harassment with no injury, and it would go nowhere while the pressure kept building at home. He was a young dog chasing a car with no idea what he'd do if he actually caught it. I set my plate down, looked at Sophie, gave her a small, steady nod, and turned back to Tyler. I left the gloves on the ground. "Gloves protect your hands," I said. "I don't need that kind of protection." I pulled off my flannel overshirt and walked out onto the open grass at the center of the cul-de-sac. Rich laughed loudly from the sidelines. "Finish this fast, Ty. Show this nobody what a real athlete looks like." I settled into a loose, low stance, hands open at chest height, weight centered, nothing like a boxer's guard, nothing that looked trained to an untrained eye. To Tyler, it looked like a man who didn't know what he was doing. To anyone who'd actually studied close-quarters work, it was a stance built for one purpose: efficient, minimal force neutralization. Rules. Tyler smirked, bouncing on his toes, rolling his neck theatrically for the crowd. Just one, I said, watching the small tells in his shoulders and hips instead of his eyes. When you're ready to stop, stay down. Fighting, at its core, is about who processes information faster, who observes, decides, and acts before the other person finishes reacting. Tyler's whole approach had been built around looking good for a scoring judge holding a clipboard, not around reading an opponent who refused to move the way he expected. That gap was about to cost him everything. He didn't wait for anything resembling a signal. He came in with a loud, showy front kick meant to look devastating for the crowd, telegraphing it a full half-second before it landed anywhere close. I stepped off the center line, let it sail past my hip, and used his own forward momentum to redirect him past me, a small, almost gentle guiding motion. He stumbled hard across the grass, nearly face-planting before catching himself at the curb, spinning around in confusion. Dead silence from the crowd. Lucky step, he snapped, resetting, higher on his toes now, adrenaline clearly starting to cloud his technique. He abandoned strikes for his signature spinning back kick, a move built to look spectacular on a padded mat against a compliant partner, and built to fail badly on uneven grass against someone who wasn't standing still. As he turned his back to generate the spin, he made the one mistake you're never allowed to make in a real exchange: he took his eyes off me completely. I stepped in, closed distance before the kick could extend, hooked his planted leg, and a simple redirected push sent both his feet off the ground at once. He landed flat on his back with a hollow thud that made half the picnic wince. "You're down," I said quietly. "That means we're done. Get up. Finish it." Rich screamed from the sideline, spraying beer as he waved his arms. Rich's voice did what my calm couldn't: it filled Tyler with a fresh, blind, humiliated rage. He surged up and charged in low, arms wide, trying to tackle me to the ground where his size might matter. I widened my stance, dropped my hips, and his charge stopped dead, like he'd run into a wall. I wrapped an arm across his shoulders and applied firm downward pressure at an angle that folded him forward at 90 degrees, weight pinning him harmlessly, face toward the grass, no chokehold, no strikes, just leverage. "Breathe," I said quietly near his ear. "You're burning oxygen on panic. Tap when you're ready." 5 long seconds later, his hand slapped the ground 3 times. I released immediately and stepped back to a clean distance. Tyler collapsed onto his back, chest heaving, mud on his $400 shorts, his reputation lying in the grass next to him. No one clapped. No one cheered. The street had just watched the quiet dad from the garage take apart a regional champion without throwing a single punch. Then Rich exploded. "You son of a..." He came storming across the lawn, red-faced, screaming that I'd assaulted his son, that he had lawyers on retainer, that he'd take my house. "Call them," I said, arms crossed. "Let's get it all on record." 10 minutes later, 2 Brookhaven squad cars rolled up. Rich rushed the responding officer, Sergeant Alvarez, with a version of events where Tyler had been standing peacefully and I'd attacked him unprovoked. Before I said a word, Walter stepped forward. "That's not what happened, officer." Tyler brought the gloves. He threw the first one. Marcus never landed a single strike, he just kept redirecting the boy until he gave up. A teenager 3 houses down held up his phone. "I've got the whole thing on video." The footage was clean and undeniable, Tyler as the aggressor from the first thrown glove to the final tap. Sergeant Alvarez watched it twice, jaw tightening, then turned to Rich with the expression of a man who'd run out of patience an hour before he actually arrived. "Sir, based on this footage, your son initiated an assault by throwing the first item and issuing a physical challenge, and the other party used reasonable, non-lethal force to defend himself. If anyone's leaving here in cuffs today, it's your son." Rich sputtered that he knew the mayor, that he'd personally funded a fundraiser for the county sheriff, that this department would regret treating him like a common citizen. Alvarez wasn't moved an inch. "Sir, you can pack up and take your son home right now, or I can arrest him for assault and you for disorderly conduct after the way you've spoken to me and to these witnesses. That's the whole menu. Choose." Rich looked around at 24 neighbors watching in silence, found no sympathy anywhere, and grabbed Tyler roughly by the arm, dragging him toward the golf cart. He paused just long enough to hiss over his shoulder that this wasn't over, that he'd find out exactly where I worked, and that he'd end my career the same way he built his fortune, quietly, and without ever getting his own hands dirty. He tried. That's where the story really turns. The following Wednesday, Rich hired a private investigator to dig into my employment, hoping to pressure my employer into firing me. What his investigator couldn't uncover, because it sat behind federal contracting clearances, was that my consulting business, Ryder Sentinel Group, wasn't just a small garage operation running security cameras for local shops. It was a vetted subcontractor for a regional Department of Homeland Security logistics security program, and I wasn't an employee. I was the founder and sole principal. My firm ran background security assessments on companies bidding for sensitive regional transport contracts. Rich's company, Whitfield Development and Logistics, had spent the better part of a year chasing exactly that kind of contract, the one that would have taken his business from regional to statewide. On Wednesday morning, Rich used a political contact to get a call with the regional program director, a man named Colonel Daniels, and spent 15 minutes demanding that a violent, unstable contractor be pulled off active assessments, never mentioning that his son had thrown the first glove. I know exactly how that call ended, because Colonel Daniels, who'd served 2 tours with me overseas, called me laughing about it that same afternoon. "Marcus, you won't believe this. Some real estate guy named Whitfield just spent 10 minutes demanding I fire you." I asked if he'd mentioned his son threw the first punch. "Left that part out," Daniels said. I let him finish, then I told him that Ryder Sentinel Group is the exact firm assigned to run final security vetting on his logistics bid, and that you're the lead assessor on his file. Given the personal hostility he'd just expressed toward you, that's an immediate conflict of interest. His bid is disqualified. Effective today. I hadn't lifted a finger to end Rich Whitfield's business ambitions. His own temper had done it for me, the same way it always had, in miniature, on our shared fence line all summer long. I sat with that thought for a long moment after I hung up the phone, staring out the window toward the Whitfield estate, feeling not triumph exactly, but something closer to a long overdue exhale. The rest unraveled fast. The video from the picnic made its way around the neighborhood group chat, then the local high school, then further. Tyler's head instructor at Ironclad, a serious, old-school competitor named Coach Maureen who'd built his reputation over 20 years of discipline and quiet professionalism, saw the footage circulating among his own students before Tyler even had a chance to explain himself. Maureen did not tolerate street fighting, bullying, or anything that dragged his academy's name through a comment section. When Tyler showed up for practice that Saturday, Maureen called him to the center of the mat in front of the entire class, told him plainly that everything the gym stood for was the opposite of what that video showed, and stripped him of his rank on the spot. He was banned from the facility indefinitely. His training partners, the same 2 who'd laughed along at the picnic, stopped returning his calls within the week. It turned out their loyalty had been rented, not earned. Tyler spent the rest of that summer mostly indoors, the pads and the heavy bag hanging untouched in the side yard, gathering dust and the occasional curious glance from kids riding past on their bikes, no longer forced into the street. Rich's business slid just as fast as his son's reputation. The lost DHS-adjacent contract spooked 2 of his largest investors, who quietly pulled their backing over what one termed, in an email that somehow found its way around the neighborhood group chat, erratic leadership and poor judgment under pressure. Permit approvals that used to sail through suddenly took months. Contractors who used to answer his calls immediately started taking longer and longer to call back. By the first frost that November, a moving truck sat in front of the Whitfield estate for most of a cold, gray Saturday. The for sale sign had gone up weeks earlier without much fanfare, quietly, the way people do things when they'd rather not be asked questions about it. Rich and Tyler packed up and left Brookhaven for good that afternoon, trading a neighborhood that now knew exactly who they were for a fresh start somewhere no one had seen the video yet. The block party slowly resumed after the cruisers pulled away, though the atmosphere had shifted for good. People didn't just see me as Marcus, Sophie's dad, the guy who fixes camera systems, anymore. They asked quiet questions to make sure I was okay. A few of them, the ones who'd lived next to the Whitfields' noise and posturing all summer without saying anything, came by that week just to thank me, almost sheepishly, like they felt they should have said something sooner. Sophie hugged me tight in front of everyone, not caring who saw, and whispered, "Are you okay, Dad?" I told her I was fine, that it was over, and kissed the top of her head. I didn't tell her yet that I fully expected Rich to try something. I just didn't expect it to backfire on him quite that fast. I stood on my porch with a mug of coffee, watching the truck disappear around the corner for the last time. The fence line was finally quiet, no more pads swinging in the side yard, no more slow-rolled cars idling past the bus stop, no more shouted comments meant to be overheard. Walter came by later that afternoon with a six-pack, and we sat on the porch steps talking about nothing in particular, the way neighbors are supposed to. Sophie came home from a friend's house, dropped her bag by the door, and asked if the Whitfields were really gone for good. "Looks like it," I told her, and she let out a breath I hadn't realized she'd been holding for months. That evening, after dinner, I turned around, walked back inside, and sat down at the kitchen table to help Sophie with her algebra homework, the same as any other Tuesday. My fighting days were long behind me, and I intended to keep them there. But it was good to know, quietly, that the training was still there if it was ever needed again, and better still to know that most nights, it wouldn't be. If you loved watching an entitled bully and his arrogant father finally face a reality they never saw coming, hit that like button and subscribe to Storiez Tales. We bring you the most satisfying real-life justice stories every week. Drop a comment telling us how you'd have handled Tyler, and share this with someone who loves a good instant karma ending. Thanks for watching.